So, in order to go out to sea, we needed to prepare and verify everything on one hand, because a maritime expedition is much more complex than a land-based one. Before this latest maritime expedition, we conducted 5 field sessions. We went to Mauritania, to the eye of the Sahara, the Richat Structure, and its surroundings. And the main thing we achieved during these 5 land expeditions was that we became 100% convinced that Plato, in describing the landscape of Atlantis, didn't lie in a single word. That is, all the landscape features that Plato indicated in his works, Timaeus and Critias, match to the letter. Well, maybe the dimensions vary a bit, but that's forgivable because in the times of ancient travelers, measuring with precision down to meters, or even kilometers was unrealistic. We're talking about things like the eye of the Sahara having a diameter of about 50 kilometers. Well, who could measure that 12,000 years ago when we're talking about the events described in Timaeus and Critias? So, we found probably 25, maybe even more coincidences. That's a lot. Even if there are 5 to 7 coincidences, you can already talk about practically hitting the bullseye without a doubt. But try to describe any unusual place, give a dozen characteristic features, and find it on the planet if these aren't standard boxes, some kind of natural formations where everything described actually exists. We have 25 such coincidences. I won't list them all here, but it's interesting. You can watch previous videos where, expedition after expedition, we accumulated these findings, not all at once, but over 5 expeditions each time. At first, the most came from the first expedition, then we kept adding a little more each time. And today, we have this amazing number. Translating these 25 coincidences into probability, we have practically 100% confidence that the eye of the Sahara, the Richat Structure, and the surrounding objects on the Adrar Plateau in Mauritania was the legendary Platonic Atlantis, which he described as an island. And it became an island because the Adrar Plateau was washed by 2 gigantic rivers on both sides. From one side, from the north, it was the now-dried Tamanrasset River, whose width sometimes reached 90 kilometers. Today, the widest river in the world, the Amazon, is 15 kilometers at flood stage, but there it was 90. It's easy to confuse that with a sea gulf or a sea itself. And from the north, supporting this huge territory of the island of Atlantis, or rather, the island itself, was the Senegal River, or a similar river that flowed somewhere nearby. The Senegal hasn't dried up even now, though it's become much shallower and narrower. But back then, it too was maybe kilometers, perhaps tens of kilometers wide. So, this island of Atlantis, washed by these 2 rivers, disappeared in some water cataclysm that Plato described as a catastrophe, as the anger of the gods, and so forth. And we saw on the Adrar Plateau traces of this most powerful water flow, which apparently washed away all those artifacts that Plato also described. He also described in detail buildings, statues, some harbors, some bridges, and so on. Now there's nothing of that there. It's as if a broom swept through, and that broom was a gigantic water flow, a gigantic tsunami, which apparently came from the direction of the Mediterranean Sea, washed everything off the coast and threw it onto the western shore of Africa, where now there's a shelf off Mauritania. And so, to test this hypothesis and try to find artifacts swept from the land building blocks, maybe we'd get lucky and find a hand from a statue or some gold or silver or bronze items. Something, just one single find would radically change the attitude toward Plato's words. But today, we can only be certain that he described the landscape from someone's words, obviously. He himself was never there. And Solon, his great-great-grandfather, also wasn't there. He relied on translations from Egyptian priests in the city of Sais. And the priests themselves weren't there either. Someone from among the ancient travelers who visited this area 12,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, it doesn't matter. When the Sahara was green and full of water, the eye of the Sahara, the Richat Structure, looked exactly as Plato described the capital of Atlantis. And we verified this many times over. And so there was this intrigue in organizing the maritime expedition to try to find on the Mauritanian shelf, by chance, something clinging, protruding from the sands, from the sediment, remnants of Atlantis. The preparation was serious. We started it somewhere in February of this year. And this whole expedition took place from November 20th to December 5th. Initially, we planned 2 40-foot catamarans, fairly reliable vessels. They were described to us as boats on which you could actually cross part of the Atlantic Ocean. Thinking about how to organize the expedition logistics, We needed to reach specific points located approximately 100 kilometers from the Mauritanian coast. There, where this dried-up Tamanrasset River once spread into multiple channels, there was the Tamanrasset Delta. Multiple islands formed, which are now under the ocean surface. The ocean has risen approximately 80 meters over the past 12,000 years. And the depth in the place where we conducted our underwater research with an underwater drone is currently 15-20-30 meters. So back then, all of this was dry land. And our hope was that on this former land, now an underwater plain of the former Tamanrasset Delta, we would see at least something suspicious, reminding us of Plato's description, even if in a broken and weathered form. If we got lucky, maybe we would find some remains of harbors or some colonies of Atlantis there. So, to get to this location 100 kilometers off the coast of Mauritania, strangely enough, we couldn't set sail from Mauritania itself. Although that would have been the shortest route and the inconveniences that the expedition had to endure would have been minimized. It turns out that Mauritania doesn't have a single proper port in our understanding, with yachts, catamarans, or any decent vessels available for rent. And we had to look for alternative routes. We looked at the Canary Islands, we looked at Madeira, we looked at Majorca, but it turned out that the closest and most logical option was to rent a vessel on the Cape Verde Islands. They're located right across from Mauritania, about 600 kilometers from the coast of this country. So, flying into Cape Verde and settling on one of the islands, we chose Sal Island because there's a direct flight from Moscow through Casablanca. We rented our vessel. At first, we thought we'd take one catamaran, then considered taking a second one. But as the expedition was being prepared, we had 10 people signed up, but gradually, due to various circumstances, it became 9, then 8, then 7, then 6, down to a final count of 5. I even joked that it's like the saying, 10 brave men went swimming in the sea, and one by one they counted down to 0. That's a joke, of course. Everyone who couldn't make it on this expedition is feeling pretty down right now, because this was an absolutely spectacular voyage, a magnificent experience, and each of them is kicking themselves that due to various life and work circumstances, they couldn't go. But as a result, when the crew settled at 5 people, taking 2 catamarans became both financially burdensome. We wouldn't have been able to afford it and pointless because the catamaran we took had 4 double cabins, 2 small double cabins like capsules, and there were a couple more spots in the middle section. In the main cabin, you could settle quite comfortably and even sleep conveniently on these seats. I didn't know this before, but it turns out this is actually the best spot because there's less seasickness, more oxygen, it's not such an enclosed space. So in principle, if you pack a catamaran like sardines in a barrel, you can fit 12 people. But I would by no means recommend such a large crew embarking on such a voyage, because first of all, the ocean is the ocean. It became clear quite quickly that although the catamaran is generally reliable and well insulated from water penetration from outside, many of the hatches started leaking. These hatches serve multiple purposes. On one hand, they're evacuation routes. On another, they provide light, and on yet another, they're just for comfort, for looking out, and so on. But when you have a giant wave, and the waves sometimes reached 5 meters in height, which by the way isn't the biggest for the ocean, but to us it seemed like we were already on the path to some kind of catastrophe, and this wave would wash over the catamaran from top to bottom, some hatches would leak. Consequently, our double cabins turned into single occupancy ones, because the rest was flooded with seawater. And so, moving around a bit sideways, away from the hatch, protecting yourself as best you can with some plastic bags, you eventually end up with one person living in each cabin. Accordingly, the 5th person lived in the main cabin, and the captain, who was a professional hired by the company that rented us the catamaran, also initially, as planned, slept in the main cabin at night, but more often at the helm because he still needed to watch the autopilot, watch the horizon, so that God forbid there wouldn't be any unpleasant situation with oncoming or crossing vessels. I'll say right away that everything went great for us. There were no extreme situations, no encounters with other vessels, nothing like that happened. In this regard, the expedition went wonderfully, except for the pitching, the water washing over, and literally in the first few hours, actually probably not even an hour had passed, some guys started showing clear signs of seasickness. I hope I don't need to explain what that is and what consequences it leads to. The fact is that people gradually started dropping out, and having emptied their stomachs, they would move to their cabins to fall asleep as quickly as possible, to somehow pass the time so nothing would bother them and nobody would disturb them. for most of the journey, and we traveled for 4 days in that direction, 700 kilometers from Cape Verde to the Mauritanian shelf, while on the return trip we raced back in 2.5 days. That is, on the return the wind was favorable, the wave was also favorable, we easily rode up on it, descended like on a slide, there was pitching but it was smoother without impacts, without shaking and so on. But going there, well, it was quietly terrifying. And this despite the fact that the captain warned us in advance. He said, "Guys, let's leave immediately." As soon as we boarded the catamaran, he said, "You want to spend 2 days sailing between the islands, but while you're sailing these 2 days, the weather will deteriorate, and then you'll go in even harsher conditions. But if we leave now, you can get through relatively easily." We listened to the captain, and generally speaking, we didn't regret it, although we got tossed around pretty good. But if we had been tossed around even more, there probably could have been more serious consequences. Be that as it may, after 4 days we reached our destination. And here, as if by magic, the wind died down, the clouds dispersed, the sun came out warm, bright, the flies weren't biting, birds were already flying. I was surprised that seagulls fly 100 kilometers out, reaching these places, and it was shallow water. That is, as if by order, just as it was marked on the map that the Tamanrasset Delta extends almost 100 kilometers from the coast, so it turned out to be. Of course, there were a large number of fishing vessels there. Naturally, it's a shallow area, a feeding ground for fish, convenient and so forth, and the fishermen were right there. But on the other hand, they didn't really bother us, except that maneuvering at night had to be done carefully because such a concentration of these fishing boats could lead to a collision, which was completely undesirable for us. But we overcame all that too. So, with the wind having died down, with the waves having calmed, we unpacked our underwater drone, unpacked the sonar, launched the aerial quadcopter in general, we conducted all the filming and surveys that were planned. The only thing is, in much smaller volume than we planned on land. We thought we'd spend 3 days there working, right? Now, 3 days, after 4 days during which many people didn't eat, didn't sleep, and walked around bent over, not 3 days, we lasted about 3 hours for examining the seafloor. But this turned out to be enough for the expedition's tasks to be fully completed. We hoped that we would see stones on the bottom, similar or not similar to structures, some rubble or something. There was nothing of the sort in this place. The entire bottom, and probably this extends for hundreds of square kilometers, was covered with fine sand and shell fragments. The shells had been broken by the waves into the tiniest pieces, and all this covers the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean on the Tamanrasset Shelf like a plush carpet. I don't know what depth, but I think tens of meters. Therefore, to hope that in some place there was a tower more than 10 meters high that survived under the waves of that tsunami that passed through, the landscape didn't allow for it. So after taking pictures and visually examining how it all looks, we conclude that searching for traces of Atlantis in this place without drilling or some kind of underwater excavation work is pointless. But it's possible in the future, if we have that future, to shift the center of gravity of the search further into the ocean, where the Tamanrasset already dropped off steeply downward and carved out so-called underwater canyons. On the slopes of these underwater canyons, which begin at depths of 200 meters and reach several kilometers, if we have in the future a more powerful, deeper diving drone, we can already try to look at the slopes where there isn't this sand, where something could have caught or been preserved from ancient structures. Therefore, we're not crossing out future research. We simply now better understand what kind of research vessel is needed, certainly more powerful than a 40-foot catamaran, what kind of drone is needed, substantially more deep diving than one rated for 100 meters, better around 500 meters. And accordingly, the equipment for lowering this drone and raising it should be more professional. But we fulfilled our task, our amateur task, our preliminary reconnaissance. The entire team is proud that the set objectives were achieved. Nobody gave up. Nobody asked the captain to turn back saying they're dying or feeling terrible, or that the water ran out, the food isn't going down, and everything's not as they imagined. All the men, all the guys endured this. And having returned back to Cape Verde, after resting 3 days on land, a break was necessary because after all that pitching we needed to recover, gain weight, eat normally, sleep properly, take a shower. We hadn't showered all that time because when we started taking showers, the water ran out literally after 2 days. After all, the freshwater supplies on a catamaran are limited. And after that we economized and used water only for the most necessary technical needs and for drinking. As a result, we managed completely. And food, there was even too much left over. We thought it would be like a normal expedition with breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day, but nothing of the sort. No breakfast, no lunch, no dinner for most expedition members. Several people held up normally, had breakfast or lunch lying down, naturally the captain among them, but there weren't many of us like that. The rest of the group was waiting for solid ground under their feet. And having waited and stepped onto Sal Island, we lived several days in hotels, put ourselves in order, and having recovered again, we boarded the ship again, nobody chickened out, and set off for the nearest island, Boa Vista. On this island, in addition to our plan to research the Mauritanian shelf, we conducted research proving or disproving the myth of Plato's Atlantis. On this island, as professional geologists believe, and we verified their predictions or their conclusions, they're past 12,000 years ago. Again, a coincidence with Plato. Though they speak of a range around 12,000 years ago, we immediately narrow this range down to exactly 12,000 years. A gigantic mega-tsunami passed through from the direction of Mauritania. So again, another coincidence. And this mega-tsunami tore enormous megalithic blocks of limestone from the bedrock foundation of Boa Vista Island and threw them up like matchsticks for 100 or 200 meters upward. These blocks now lie scattered as separate pieces. There are no visible traces of human processing on them. That is, it's impossible to attribute them as remnants of some structures. But there are visible scratches and dents, which geologists interpret as proof that they were torn out by a giant geological wave from the limestone foundation. And we agree with this conclusion. But the very fact that 12,000 years ago there was a most powerful water wave here, and it could have passed through all of Mauritania, and it could have washed away the anthropomorphic remnants and traces of Atlantis, it all seems to fall into one line of evidence. In any case, it was interesting to walk along the coast of Boa Vista Island and observe these blocks scattered mainly on the eastern side, meaning the wave came from the west. This directional evidence was particularly compelling when we examined the distribution pattern of these massive limestone blocks across the landscape. We found almost no other evidence, with one exception. In one place where streams, quite powerful streams from rainfall, had carved something like a small ravine, at the bottom of this ravage there was a relatively small limestone slab about 15 centimeters thick. And in this slab was a very round hole. The first impression makes you ask the question, maybe it was drilled recently 50 years ago? But looking at the surrounding landscape, we found nothing there resembling such work. Humans are naturally present there. There's a wall made of rough stone, but there's no talk of any processing, much less drilling. This is only hypothetically, very hypothetically speaking. Of course, one could say that these are artifacts from the times of Atlantis or from times closer to this Atlantean period. But how to verify it? When can we say that these are truly ancient artifacts, that ancient people could have drilled a neat hole with a diameter of about 15 centimeters and to a depth of 15 centimeters? I can't imagine how to prove this yet. Maybe some method will be found, or more such holes and slabs will be discovered on Boa Vista. Then we'll be able to draw some conclusions. For now, this is just a lead, a clue. Another clue is these discs. Those who have followed our videos know that these discs are found quite often on the territory of the Eye of the Sahara. They're found in sands, in sediments that can be dated to thousands of years ago. That is, these discs are not new, they don't relate to the modern civilization of those residents who populate Mauritania. This is a pre-Muslim period, meaning more than several thousand years ago. Ancient people somehow gained access to these manufactured items. The precision and craftsmanship visible in these discs raises profound questions about the technological capabilities of their creators. Some archaeologists with whom we're acquainted and have discussed this find say that these are discs from Neolithic times. That is, they're 7,000, 10,000, maybe even more than 10,000 years old. But the quality of manufacturing of such a disc and the abilities of Neolithic people somehow don't align in our understanding. The level of precision required to create such perfectly circular objects with such smooth surfaces seems to exceed what we know of Neolithic technology. Therefore, we allow for the possibility, although we cannot confirm this with any proof, that these discs also relate to the times of Atlantis, that they were made long before the Neolithic period. And subsequently they simply fell into the hands of Neolithic people who adapted them for their own purposes, sawing or scraping, used them in some other operations, or ultimately as decorations or memorial objects. We don't know for certain. In general, this is a mystery that needs to be attempted to be solved and appropriate conclusions drawn. are attempts to find on the surface of the conical or cylindrical parts of these disks remnants of metal microinclusions, which could indicate the technological origin of the tool that processed this disk, have so far led to nothing. There are some granules there, but they should more likely be attributed to modern contamination. After all, this disk and other similar ones have been in the hands of dozens, if not hundreds of people. Someone among them scratched it with a watch, a ring, or something else, and microparticles remain. The challenge of distinguishing ancient manufacturing traces from modern contamination presents a significant methodological obstacle in our research. In general, today this remains a mystery. And to this mystery was added that hole which we discovered on Boa Vista. But let me draw some conclusions from what I've told you about our maritime expedition. First, the expedition was fruitful. The goals were achieved. The results, true, the positive ones that we could have hoped for in our sweetest dreams, discovering Atlantis in the form of artifacts, even such as these disks, we cannot say today that we discovered them. But we also haven't ruled them out. That is, the necessity to continue research is evident and undeniable. The preliminary reconnaissance we conducted has given us invaluable information about where and how to focus future efforts. And we are ready to form new groups for land-based travels through the eye of the Sahara and the Adrar Plateau. In February of the upcoming year 2026, we have another expedition planned. Therefore, for those interested in testing themselves in such a land expedition, it's much simpler and more comfortable than what I described about the maritime expedition sign-up. Go to the website atlanti.gg. There in February there's a corresponding page. Write your contact information, and we'll get in touch with you. And if a group of at least 5 to 6 people is formed, we'll set off on our 6th land expedition. We'll continue searching for additional proof that Plato's Atlantis was precisely here. And if we're lucky, maybe we'll find some artifacts on land. The land expeditions offer a completely different experience, more accessible, less physically demanding, but no less exciting in terms of potential discoveries. And next fall, if everything goes normally and we also gather 5 to 6 people who are interested, we'll organize a repeat maritime expedition as well. Taking into account the difficulties that existed in this one, we'll try to simplify the route, maybe resolve some technical issues in advance. We've learned valuable lessons about vessel selection, equipment requirements, and the physical demands of such an undertaking. And together with the group that will be assembled, we'll look at where and what we'll research, first examining the seafloor and land in the area of the Cape Verde Islands and along the route from Cape Verde to the coast of Mauritania. This expedition hasn't been scheduled yet, but as soon as the first interested person appears, and you can contact us by our phone numbers, in any case, get in touch or write to me by email, geom2004@mail.ru. Say that you have such an intention, and we'll already discuss how much this intention can be embodied into real action. In any case, everyone who participated in this maritime expedition, despite all these difficulties and illnesses, are happy that they experienced all the emotions that rushed over us during this journey. And they're ready to repeat such a journey, and not just once in the future. The bonds formed during such challenging expeditions, the shared experience of pushing through adversity, and the thrill of exploration create memories that last a lifetime. So join us. This is much more interesting than sitting at home on the couch and debating whether Atlantis existed or didn't exist. Even if it didn't exist, we still need to search for it. And what if someone gets lucky, and like Heinrich Schliemann discovering Troy, our search becomes reality? The possibility of being part of a discovery that could rewrite our understanding of ancient history, that's worth any amount of seasickness or discomfort. Adventure awaits those brave enough to seek it.